Hello, I'm Aubni, and in this series I will show you the process through which I go to make a minigame. The game that I'll be making consists of multiple minigames all at once, so it is a great opportunity to showcase different types of games that you can make, the problems to avoid when making them, and tricks I've come up with over time to make them more enjoyable. If you want to know more about the whole minigame, I suggest you watch the first episode of this series where I give a description of the entire project. In this episode, we will be taking a look at games that involve shooting things with a bow, crossbow, or actually any projectile item. For these games specifically, there are three things that you need to take into consideration: the weapon or item your player will use, the things they will shoot at, and the conditions under which the players will shoot. So first, let's look at the weapons or items that the players will use. The most obvious one is, of course, the bow, but you can also use a crossbow. For games, they are mostly the same, the biggest difference being the reloading time and the fact that crossbows have the possibility of multi-shot and fireworks. But there are other weapons and items that you can use. These might not look like a bow, but on the most basic level, mechanics-wise, they work the exact same way. You need to aim them at a target, evaluate the trajectory, and shoot or throw it at the right time. Alternatives to the bow or crossbow could be tridents if your game is underwater or if you want to move your player around the place, fishing rods if you want your players to pull items or entities, ender pearls if you want your player to teleport around, splash potions if you want to... well, I don't really have an idea for that one, but maybe you do, and that's what counts. Then you have to decide what your players will be shooting at. Are they shooting at a wooden button or pressure plate, a target block, an armor stand, a minecart, a mob, an unsuspecting player? All these things have different effects and ways to measure if and how they have been hit that can have a big impact on what your game will end up like. The last and, in my opinion, the most important thing to take into consideration is the context in which your players will be shooting at their targets. Shooting at a target block with a bow, crossbow, or trident doesn't really change anything, but there are other things that you can adjust to make things more interesting. Will your players be free to move around? Are they going to be forced to move through a certain path, or will they stand in a specific position? Will they have a limited number of arrows, or as many as they want? Same with time, limited or unlimited? Will your player's vision be impaired, for example by wearing a pumpkin or having the nausea effect? Will your game involve multiple players, and if so, how will one's gameplay affect the other one's? If you repeat the game, will every challenge be exactly the same, or will they change? When you think of everything I just mentioned, plus every idea that you have and that I didn't think of, there are so many possible ways to combine these things to make a game. Then you can start thinking of a theme and the evolution of difficulty. As for any game, a theme is not mandatory, but it can definitely help for immersion and inspiration. If you want to hear more about themes, you can watch the first two videos of this series where I talk about those in a lot more details. As for difficulty, it really depends on the style of the game itself and what type of challenges your players will be facing. If you need to shoot more targets than your opponent, or hit every target as fast as possible, the challenge is external, so the difficulty itself does not necessarily need to increase. But if the challenge is internal to the game itself, for example if your game follows a specific timeline and challenges are happening in a certain order, you definitely need to think of how difficulty progresses. Depending on the kind of game, difficulty can be increased by, for example, lowering the effective size of your target or decreasing the time window where you can shoot at it. Now, for the siege simulator, there will be two parts to the bow shooting section of the game. In the first one, the player will be shooting at a target block multiple times to stop their opponent from climbing a parkour course. If the player fails that first part and the opponent reaches the top, the second part will start and they will have a few seconds to shoot some armor stands. Let's take a look at how the first part works. Every time you will shoot an arrow at the target block, it will read the redstone value of that shot. The The system will then add that value to the sum of all the previous values that you got. When the sum reaches 15, it will reset itself and it will stop your opponent's parkour run. Let's watch that system in action. To make it simpler, I replace the target block with a contraption that lets me choose what value I send into the system. At the beginning, there is a value of 0 stored in the memory. If I send a value of 2, it now outputs 2. If I then send, for example, a value of 3, it will now output 5. If I send, let's say, 7, it will now output 12. And if I set anything higher than 3, it will reach 15 and it will reset itself. If you want to add together the power value of two different signals, you need to use a system like this one here. Since we can only subtract values with comparators, this works by taking a value of 15, subtracting both values that we want to add, then subtracting the result again from 15. Then we send the result of this operation to this part here. This circuit stores the power level in its memory until you either override it with a higher value or reset it back to 0. Resetting it can be done by removing either these blocks from the circuit or subtracting a high enough value from either comparator. Then we take the value stored in the memory of the circuit and send it back around to one input of the addition circuit. And then we send the power output from the target block to the other input of the addition circuit. Now we run into a bit of a problem. The output of the target block lasts for a full second, so it ends up adding its value more than once. So we need to lock the previous value not too long after the shot is being made. We do this by switching this comparator to subtract mode and running a repeater set to 4 ticks into its side. That way, the previous power level is active for long enough to add both values, but not so long that it gets counted twice. After that, we need to detect when the total power level has reached 15 to reset the memory and stop the parkour. This will be done with a comparator on comparison mode that will remove this block from the circuit and send a signal to the parkour course. To balance things out, I decided to lower the value output by the target block by 7 so that it requires more shots to reach full power. That way, you can reach full power after 2 almost perfect shots, but you will probably need more than that. This value might eventually get adjusted if the game needs to be balanced. And finally, there will be this one comparator here set to subtract mode between the target block and the input of the addition circuit. The function of this comparator will be given later in the video. So now we can take a look at the second part. If the opponent reaches the top, they will deploy a series of armor stands that each activate a pressure plate. These pressure plates will all be linked together to activate a timer of about 9 seconds. Again, this value might get adjusted to balance the game. If that timer runs out, the player loses. But if they can break them all before that, it will stop and reset the timer. For this, we will use a hopper clock with one of the sticky pistons replaced by a regular piston. This turns this clock into a timer that starts when we update this piston here, and we can detect when the timer has run its course when this redstone dust turns off. Like this. In our case, we will invert this signal by placing a redstone torch here and running it into a repeater. We then need to detect if any of these pressure plates are still being powered when the timer runs out. So to do so, we simply link them all together with a line of redstone dust. We invert the signal and we run it into the side of this repeater here. You might need to play around with the torches a little because you need this repeater here to be locked unpowered. We can then see that if any of these pressure plates are still being powered when this torch turns back on, so when the timer runs out, the signal will go through. This is how we will detect that the player has lost. Finally, there is another part of the game that can give two different temporary disadvantages for the bow shooting part of the game. That part will be described in a future episode, but we can still look at what effects it will have. The first disadvantage will send a power level of 1 on the side of this comparator here, lowering the power input of every shot on the target block by 1, thus forcing the player to take more shots. The second one will simply add another armor stand in the assault launched when the invader reaches the top of the walls. This will simply be done by powering this sticky piston here to move this block here to complete this redstone line. So this is it for the bow shooting part of the Siege Simulator. In the next episode, we will be looking at mazes and how they will be implemented in my game. I hope you enjoyed and see ya in the next one.